Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm just here to talk to you about a pack that I've been putting together for primary school teachers. It's a resource pack based on the War of Independence in County Clare. I've given the title The Brave and the Bold, and the pack really looks at the years 1919 to 1921 and the events that occurred in County Clare. It will also look at some of the root causes of the War of Independence. So therefore, it will go back and reference the years 1913 up to 1918 to take those events into account as leading into the War of Independence. Just to show you where we begin, maybe the rationale in this to do with the pack would be very many families would have a War of Independence medal at home, and children would often ask, or if you'd ask them to bring in objects from home, one or two might appear with a War of Independence medal. But when you'd ask kids about the War of Independence, many of them would know very little about it, except maybe their own family members' involvement in it, and maybe a story or two about the Black and Tans. So the idea kind of came to me that maybe we structured a kind of pack really would help with children's understanding of the War of Independence. So I tried to figure out how I would arrange such a pack. So that was really the rationale behind it. So one of the easiest ways to explain the structure of the pack really to children is to start off with what they know, and you have to ask the children what they know, had they any stories from home, and what could they share, or what did they know about the time. And I suppose when you're dealing with events from more than 100 years ago, it's important to show pictures and photographs in so far as possible. And maps also are a very good way to start. So most children in 5th and 6th class, which is really where the pack is aimed, would be familiar with the map or the shape of County Clare. So Marie Knoll kindly devised this pen and ink drawing for me, and she has broken the county into the 3 sections for the 3 different brigades that were in operation in County Clare at the start of the War of Independence. When the war began, Clare really was divided into 3 brigades. Prior to that, the Clare Brigade was in operation for a number of months, and they did succeed in getting their own brigade. But if you go right back to 1916, Clare actually formed part of the Limerick Brigade, and it wasn't until just maybe around the 1918 mark that they managed to secure their own brigade. And really, on the lead up to the War of Independence, it was really getting gear for the war that Clare was divided into 3 separate brigades. So I'll move on to the second slide here. So what are the sections that I have in the pack? I started off looking at the causes. What are the root causes associated with the War of Independence? And I'll go into those in the next slide or two. The next section then is going to look at money and the finances involved, because in running a country, which the Irish volunteers were trying to do, as well as trying to run an army, it required an awful lot of money and a lot of logistics. And you'll see how they went about organizing funds and finances. The third section there is looking at the events of 1919. Fourth section then will deal with 1920. And from then we go to the last section of the War of Independence, which is 1921. But there are one group of people that cannot be forgotten, who may have their role actually in the War of Independence was limited due to the fact that they were either interned or imprisoned during the war. And it is also important for children to know this and to look at some of the stories from these prisoners and some of the conditions under which they were held. Also, then, just to finish up, there will be in the pack for primary school teachers a number of resources, online resources and books that they can have a look at. And obviously there'll be a bibliography included as well of some of the books and well-known authors from County Clare that have covered the War of Independence period. So again, just having a word back on the rationale. Very often when you're teaching history in primary school, you get the old chestnut that comes up from children that history is boring, or this is so boring, or nothing interesting ever happened around here. But it's when you actually send them home to explore maybe stories from their own family or people in their community, when they come back with these stories and they delve deeper into them, that's really when their interest develops. As well as that, I often say to them, if you're studying a period of history from a textbook in primary school, very often it's easy just to focus on the events in Dublin or the events in other parts of Ireland, and to get carried, well, I won't say carried away with them, but to focus entirely on those without even realizing that some of those events are mirrored in your own locality. And maybe we should start with our own locality and then compare those events with what's happening nationally instead of doing it the other way around. For example, just even in relation to the 1798 rebellion, a lot of people would focus exclusively on events in Wexford and that, whereas you can go a few miles out the road here from Ennis out to Mahara Church and you'll see a monument out around there for somebody who took part in the 1798 rebellion. Even in the town of Ennis, up at O'Connell Square, a lot of the people who took part in the 1798 rebellion were tied to the pillar and given the lash basically up in the square. So, those events that took place down in Wexford, there was actually a lot of events going on in the town here. Same with the Fenian Rebellion of 1867. There was a readiness in County Clare. Events took place around Kilbaha as well. Even John Devoy in one of his books there, recollections of in his own recollections, he had to refer to the events in County Clare. So again, it just shows you that things did happen locally. They may not always be recorded in the general history books. And that's really why I wanted to narrow in and focus in on a pack for primary schools in Clare. So we'll have a look at some of the activities then that I wanted to include for children. So there'll be photographs in the pack. There'll be obviously a lot of information. I try to break the information up into bite-sized pieces. And some of the activities you can see there on the screen will include similarities and differences between photographs. There will be some sort of nods or indications to go off and do a further bit of research. One that comes to mind is the 1914 All-Ireland final. There's a reference to it in the pack, and Cumann na Mán, I believe, for collecting funds in Dublin at the time when Clare played Laois. So you can see the movement involved there. So even with that particular year, 1914, they can go off and have a look at the team that played. Tomás McNamara did a wonderful publication on it. I think it was called High Prestige. And children could have a look at the book there and they'll see the photographs of the team and that. And just while I mentioned 1914 was a very, very significant year for the volunteer movement in Clare. It was the 900th anniversary of the Battle of Clontarf. And it's kind of, no wonder that they went out and won the All-Ireland hurling final that year, because they were well rallied up for the final. They even marched. I know that there was a march out in Killaloe for the 900th anniversary of the Battle of Clontarf, and I know the Ennis Brian Boru Volunteer Corps are photographed out there Franz Hasselbeck from Limerick, a well-known photographer, travelled there, and his photographs appeared in one of the newspapers at the time. If you want to see any more of his photographs, Patricia Hasselbeck Flynn has them all. Has many of them anyway published in her book. It's a wonderful book. It shows many of the RIC men in County Clare as well with their families. So her book is well worth a look. In relation to site visits, then there are many monuments around the county. Some put up in the last number of years, and some have been there for a lot longer. So again, children could be encouraged to visit the sites and monuments in their own area. Identifying causes and reasons is very important. One of the skills of the history curriculum is looking at cause and effect. Symbols and influences then will be another thing activities will look at. Photographs, as I've already mentioned, very important. Drama then, songs. There's a very interesting song in the book. It was written, or it's a song or a poem really. Very often the man who put these poems together, his name was Martin Kennedy from Violet Hill. Very often he put his poems or songs to the tune of other songs. But he has a very nice one that I've included in the pack. It's called The Irish Volunteers. And the last line of his poem or song here goes, "The captain drilled them up and down. He drilled them far away. He marched them to the chapel for a little while in prayer. He marched them to the village amidst the people's cheers, and they sang through faith and fatherland, the Irish Volunteers." And he really encapsulates the excitement that would have been there at the time within the volunteer movement. It must have been a very exciting time before the war commenced, when people were training and drilling and interested in all things Irish and gathering their uniforms and really gearing up for, I suppose, Irish freedom. So it would have been an exciting time for those, and that's encapsulated in the song and the poem. In the pack, we will also include videos. I will give links to a number of very interesting videos, which I'll talk about in a minute as we go through the rest of the slides. The timeline will be included in the pack and a calendar. So I've tried to break down the events of 1919 to 1921, as I mentioned earlier, into bite-sized pieces. And I've tried to put a caption on each year, we'll say, based on the calendar. So we'll start off with January, February, March, and just show the events inside there under the heading of each month to make them more clear for children to understand. I also more or less just dealt with the facts and we'll say what actually happened and the number of casualties or wounded involved, rather than going into a long list of names of volunteers or RIC men who were involved in the actions, because I felt that it might be easier for children to understand the whole war in terms of just the events, rather than having to remember all of the names. But I would refer people to other books if they do find an event from their own locality that the children in their area are interested in. Just look at the other books that have been written by the other authors around Clare that concern maybe greater in-depth into those events, or also if you want a good overall account of it, Blood on the Banner by Pádraig O'Rourke will give you a full rundown on the timeline of the War of Independence, so it's well worth a look. Maps again are very important. Newspapers from the time are very good as a source of evidence. Perspectives can be got from indeed those newspapers, and comparing them with the witness statements from the Bureau of Military Archives, it's a very interesting exercise to compare them. I know one newspaper account that I came across related to a raid on Roslevin House. The IRA were very annoyed at the fact that under martial law, they weren't allowed to use their bicycles. So a group of them from Ennis headed over to just the outskirts of Ennis there at Roslevin, and headed to Roslevin House, where they burnt out 2 cars and stole another car. And the leader really basically put it down to the fact that if they weren't allowed to use their bicycles, then the other crowd wouldn't be allowed to use their cars. But the interesting thing about the perspectives is the newspaper gives an account of how one of the men at Roslevin, a British Army officer, challenged the IRA men, and it says that he was accidentally shot and wounded in the newspaper account, and that the leader was very apologetic for the fact that this British Army officer was shot. However, another account in a book by Pádraig O'Rourke, it's Ernie O'Malley's discussions with the men of Clare that were involved in the War of Independence, gives a different account. I think the book is called The Men Will Talk to Me. But the account in that particular book basically says that the leader of the volunteers says that, or the leader of the IRA men at the time says that one of his men let the British Army officer have it to show them that they meant business. So again, it connects to perspectives, or you could also say maybe that the newspaper was under the power of censorship at the time and wasn't able to print the full account. But it is interesting to compare both the newspapers and the oral accounts or written evidence. Empathy then is also a very important skill from the history curriculum. So again, obviously the reprisals there are one area where you'd have a look at the skills there. So there's many stories could be explored there. In the pack, I've looked at one account from Ennis, primarily because it was written from the point of view, well, it's written by an adult, but it's written from his memory of being a child at the time. And I have included that. I'll refer to that shortly in the next couple of slides. Synthesis and communication then, in order for you to really, write a newspaper account as an activity of events of the past, you really have to understand them. And this is where the pack comes in, that by going through the pack with children, you give them a feel or an understanding for the events of the time and really what it would have been like to live through those events. And from that, then they'll be able to create their own historical fiction or accounts of, imagine they were a newspaper reporter at the time, and be able to produce a meaningful piece of work or a project. Visual arts then is obviously very important then in designing things, maybe designing commemorative medals or even designing a commemorative stamp. So those kind of activities are included in the pack. And the last item there really is a handling box. Now, you are encouraged in the history curriculum to look at the idea of a handling box for different parts of the history curriculum, or different themes, if you like. I know that Clare Education Centre has a handling box on the Bronze Age that was prepared by the National Museum of Ireland, and there were games and replica artefacts in that handling box. So it might be worth teachers' time creating a handling box of simple items from the War of Independence, and I'll refer to that again at the very end. So looking at the causes then of the War of Independence and the pack that we have prepared, the main causes there, as you can see on the slide, are nationalism and home rule. So nationalism was on the rise, but it's important to understand that this rise in nationalism wasn't just taking place in Ireland, that it was taking place in Europe and in other parts of the world at the same time. So home rule and the denial of home rule, in fact, was one of the main causes of the War of Independence. That I think that it was on Home Rule Bill number 3 at the time the First World War started. So people were getting a bit browned off of the delays in relation to having a parliament in Ireland again to make its own rules and regulations for Ireland. So that was definitely one of the causes of the War of Independence. You also had then just the whole militarization of Europe at the time, and Ireland was not, I suppose, cocooned from that or sheltered from that militarization. It was taking place here with the gun running up in the in Ulster, where they managed to land almost 25,000 rifles, I think, was it at Larne? And then you had the Howth gun running in Ireland, where in Dublin, where they only managed, I think, close to 2,500 rifles. So there was a big difference in the weaponry between Ulster and the rest of Ireland. But also, obviously, when World War I started, the game changed, and you had the National Volunteers had to decide whether they were going to support the British war effort or whether they were going to fight for an independent Ireland. So a split took place in the volunteer movement. The National Volunteers sided with the British Army, basically, and the recruitment agencies there, that they would send their members to fight in World War I against the foe, which were the German army. But the other group then that split from the National Volunteers became known as the Irish Volunteers, and they were anti-Irishmen fighting for the British Empire. You'll see the banner, it's a well-known banner from the Irish Citizen Army up in Liberty Hall, and if I recall it correctly, the words written across the top of the banner are, "We serve neither king nor Kaiser," and that would be really, I suppose, fitting for the Irish Volunteers as well. They weren't going to serve either of those two empires. They really just wanted an Irish Republic, and they weren't in favour of conscription at the time, which the British Army, or British, not really the British Army, but the British Empire or British authorities kept threatening on Ireland that they would force Irish men to join the British Army. And that threat was there constantly throughout the early years of the decade of Centenaries. 1916 Rising then, obviously, as I said at the beginning of the talk, that very often events in Dublin are mirrored, or events in Ireland as a whole are mirrored in the locality. People were ready in County Clare for the Rising at Easter time in 1916. However, the Rising was cancelled when an advert was placed in one of the newspapers, and the whole thing was called off. Now in Dublin, they decided to go ahead with the Rising, and obviously the Rising failed after a number of days, but there was a state of readiness in County Clare as well as other counties in Ireland, and people were drilling and training, and they did go and march on Easter Sunday to places to be ready for the fight, which was called off. And obviously the events then of 1916, where people were treated harshly, prisoners were rounded up and sent to places like Fronguk. So people were very put out by that. And this was shown then in 1917 and 1918 in the elections, where Sinn Féin won quite a lot of the seats. Now, for County Clare, the 1917 election of Eamon de Valera in the East Clare by-election is very, very significant, because Eamon de Valera was just out of jail a number of weeks, I think, at that stage, when he was brought to County Clare and put up against Patrick Lynch as a candidate for the seat that had become vacant. The reason the seat became vacant was because John Redmond's brother, Willie Redmond, was killed fighting in World War I. And with the empty seat, or the vacant seat, Eamon de Valera and his supporters decided to seize their opportunity. Now, it wasn't without controversy, as you'll see in the acrylic painting there on the slide that has been done by Marie Knoll. It's supposed to be a depiction of O'Connell Square in Ennis, and you'll see the RIC men trying to separate groups of, I presume, Sinn Féin supporters and Irish Party supporters at the time. And I love the image of the young girl there trying to pull back her father or grandfather there from the other people. So that's based on a photograph from the time, and up in the top corner in the top left there, actually behind the RIC man, you can see an image of Honan's shop, and Honan's shop in 1921 was actually blown up by the British Army as a reprisal for another event. So it's an interesting painting there. You can also see just on the other causes there, the land war and the RIC. And over there on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see an image from the graphic from 1890, and it's a boycotted stonebreaker from County Clare. And you can see he's been protected by the RIC men. So obviously somebody fell out with that particular gentleman during the land wars, and he was boycotted. So you can see even the picture shows that the ordinary people believed that the RIC were protecting the landed gentry, and that's very obvious as well from events like the Vandeleur evictions, where a lot of people were threatened and put out of their homes by the RIC on the orders of landlords and magistrates and justices of the peace and those people in authority, basically. So that is definitely one of the causes there, the whole events from the land war and the RIC's support of them. The RIC also had a role, obviously, in keeping down the Fenian Rising, and it is from that time that they gained the prefix Royal. Before that, they were known as the Irish Constabulary, but it was felt by the British authorities that they did such a good job that they deserved the title of Royal. So you can see again the mistrust people would have for the force. Martial law, curfews and checkpoints were also a real daily occurrence from about 1918 onwards, and a real annoyance to people in rural areas, but also in the town. Later on in the War of Independence, you can see curfews were fairly punitive. I think from March 1921, just as you were coming out of the long winter, I suppose, and coming to the better days of spring and summertime, the curfew was reduced from 9 p.m. back to 6 p.m. and it lasted from 6 p.m. in the evening until 3 a.m. in the morning. You weren't allowed outside of your home. So again, fairly stringent. And if you're living in the town in a small tenement, it must have been very bothersome and very upsetting for people. So again, they would be there were a lot of grievances held by people that led to the War of Independence. Now, moving on to getting armed up and getting tooled up and ready for a war. You can see this image here, which I believe is from the National Library of Ireland, shows I think the Scariff volunteers, and you can see them there at this stage. They've gotten uniforms and they're there. They seem to have some form of weaponry. I know the National Volunteers in Ennis had Martini rifles, and I think they had bayonets as well for the rifles by about 1915. Before that, they were training with wooden rifles. But this is an interesting photo because you can see there's a motorbike in the background on the right-hand side, and you can see there's a couple of cars there, and there may be, I can't tell, is that a bicycle or a motorbike there just in the bottom right-hand corner. But it's interesting there, you can see they started with the uniforms, and it was a very exciting time going to Limerick to get your uniform and your Sam Brown belt and all the equipment and all the gear that went with it. And just getting ready for, as they thought at that stage, the defence of Ireland from, I presume, German invasion. Now, financing a new state and a new army was going to take money, so they had to decide where were they going to get this money from during the War of Independence. So they came up with an idea of a loan bond for the Republic of Ireland. And when Eamon de Valera had escaped from Lincoln jail, he made his way across, again, he had made his way back to Ireland, and then from Ireland over to America. And he started with the organization over in America selling these bond certificates. So you can see this one is for $10 for the Republic of Ireland, and I think it mentions that it is payable after Ireland has freed itself from Britain's military control, and the bond will be redeemable thereafter within 1 year of that time. You can see Eamon de Valera's signature there in the bottom. And you can see this one is issued to James. I don't know, it looks like James T. Carney, and it has a serial number, and it's also embossed with an Irish harp there across the centre. But if you have a look at, there's a website on Michael Collins, but you may well find it as well under British Pate News. You'll find it on an internet search anyway. But these bonds were they were being sold in Ireland as well as in America. There's a lovely video clip of Michael Collins and the widows of those involved in 1916, as well as other well-known people from the revolutionary times coming to buy their bonds up at the Mansion House in Dublin. And I think Michael Collins is sitting down, and he has the wooden block that Robert Emmet unfortunately lost his head on. I think that's the block he's actually sitting at, where people come up to sign their name on the bonds. So again, symbolism is used there at the signing of the bonds, and he issues receipts then for those. But they're very interesting because in the Ennis area, you'll see, if I move to the next slide, I should have, I think, one in on that cannon there, but in the back row of the photograph there, you'll see the second man from the left in the back is Canon O'Kennedy, who I believe is from Nina in County Tipperary, but he was based in St. Flannan's College in Ennis. Now, he was handling a lot of the money for the bonds, the loan bonds in County Clare, and the bond money then would obviously be sent up to headquarters in Dublin, up to the Dáil in Dublin, and Michael Collins then would be in communication with him and send him down the receipts. I know that some receipts were sent down for the West Clare area to Father O'Kennedy. Also, in the front row of the photograph there, you'll see Bishop Fogarty, Bishop Michael Fogarty, the Bishop of Killaloe, who was based in Westbourne House in Ennis. He was actually one of the trustees of the Dáil loan bonds. So those two particular men in the photograph played a very important role in the finances of what was going to emerge as the new state of Ireland. But in relation to Canon O'Kennedy, he was actually taken from St. Flannan's College in the summer of 1921 by the British military, and he was taken basically prisoner down to Bear Island in County Cork, and he was held in solitary confinement for about 11 weeks. Now, Bear Island have on their website a very interesting documentary that they've put together. It's about 32 minutes long. If you go into it at about 26 minutes into the documentary, there's an interesting story told about Bishop Fogarty making his way down to Bear Island to find out where basically Father O'Kennedy was, if he was basically in the prison. Now, how did he get this information? Well, the story is told in the video that the local national school teacher sent his son into the prison camp where he worked as where he basically served mass for one of the prisoners. This prisoner turned out to be Father O'Kennedy, and the altar boy wasn't allowed to talk to the prisoner, but his father, the school teacher, taught the boy Latin, and the boy, while he was serving mass, asked Father O'Kennedy in Latin what his name was, who he was, where he was from, and what he was doing in the prison. So Father O'Kennedy answered him back in Latin, and the boy carried the message home to his father, the school teacher, who then got on to the local IRA to tell them that the man being kept was Father O'Kennedy, and that then message got finally brought back up to the Killaloe diocese, up to Bishop Fogarty. So Bishop Fogarty went personally down to see Father O'Kennedy, and he managed to set up a situation where Father O'Kennedy was allowed to go for a swim on his own on the beach with a number of guards. The guards were distracted, and Bishop Fogarty got to converse with Father O'Kennedy before the guards came back down to the area where he was swimming. And then the following Sunday, at a sermon at Mass in all the churches in the diocese, according to the video anyway, the public were made aware that Father O'Kennedy was being held in Bear Island, even though the British authorities had denied that they were holding him. So a very interesting story, but also two very interesting men in that photograph in relation to the finances. You'll see as well there are other interesting characters in there. I'll explain them fully in the pack when it's available to you. Now, to go into the war itself, if you have a look here at 1919, there's an image there of an Austin Mark IV armoured car coming across the Club Bridge in Ennis. So things started to heat up in 1919, and this photograph is taken about November, and it appeared in a midweek pictorial of an American newspaper. But the originals, I think, also appear in a French museum. The original glass plates are also held over there. But it's an interesting photograph because it shows, again, if you're working with children, a picture, you know, tells 1,000 words really, because you can see the British Army in the uniforms. You can imagine if you were in Ennis today, and many people have travelled over that bridge in Ennis by the Garda station, and looking at that photograph there, you know, you'd be pretty nervous going over it in 1919 if you met that coming across on the other side. But really at the start of 1919, I wanted to mention De Valera's escape from Lincoln prison. When he was imprisoned in Lincoln, he managed to make a copy of one of the prison keys out of wax. One of the prisoners then drew this key onto a card and posted it out. Michael Collins recognised on the Christmas card that it was a key for escaping from the prison, and a copy of the key was made and sent into the prison in a cake. But that unfortunately didn't work in the lock. So at least one other key was made, until finally a third blank key was made and sent in a cake with 2 nail files wrapped up, I presume in a piece of muslin or something, and placed into the middle of an oblong fruit cake and sent into the prison. And that blank key actually worked in the lock, and Eamon de Valera escaped with 2 other prisoners from the prison. I think it was Sean Milroy and Sean McGarry, and Eamon de Valera were the 3 that escaped. But the interesting story about that is that 2 Clare women were involved in that prison escape. One was Susan Talty, and the other was her sister Kathleen Talty. And they actually were involved in coming on in Manchester. And Susan's husband, Lee McMahon, was one of the leaders of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Manchester at the time. But they had a major role to play in that escape. And that'll be explained in a bit more detail in the pack. If you do want to have a look at a bit more information on the jailbreak, if you go to the visitlincoln.com website, you'll find a really, really interesting video there done by a man named Dr. Eric Grigg, and you'll find a map of the escape of Eamon de Valera on that website as well. So I'll include references to that in the pack. But going along then, that's at the start, obviously that's February 1919. As the war went on, the War of Independence, there were various attacks on RIC barracks in County Clare, and that's how 1919 really panned out. There were a lot of attacks on police barracks, and the smaller barracks began to close, and because they were pretty much defenseless against attack, they tried their best to hold out. And once the RIC withdrew out of the smaller barracks, a lot of them ended up being burnt, so they couldn't be reoccupied again. There's one event then at the end of 1919 that's worth a mention. There was a shootout that took place at Cheshire near Carron. A lot of people were injured in that. Nobody was killed, but it was an interesting event that took place there. I know one of the people involved in that was a lady named Beatrice O'Brien from Rosslevin House, which we mentioned there a while ago in the talk just outside Ennis. So that took place in December 1919, and there'll be a bit about that in the pack as well. Just this photograph here comes from the Belfast Telegraph, as you can see, and it's the 17th Tank Division in Clare in November 1919. A lot of these tanks had seen service in World War I, and you can see there's just an armoured car on the left-hand side, and you'll see two Whippet medium A tanks there making their way through what is thought to be the Mount Callan area. But the interesting thing about some of those tanks is the British Army had different names for them. One was called, they had serial numbers on them as well. A378 was known as Go Like Hell, and A230 was called Go Faster or Go Faster. So they all had nicknames on them. But that's them on their way, and they must have been a terrifying sight in the County Clare area in November 1919. Now, in 1920, there was an escalation of the war, and that's a very eventful year in County Clare. There were a lot of serious events and a lot of reprisals in the county. You can see the propaganda image there from Punch magazine of the British Army officer shaking hands with an RIC man who's obviously been wounded. And Homage from the Brave is the title of it there. And it shows you that the British Army officer who's come back from the war is obviously acknowledging that the RIC men have a tough time of it in County Clare, trying to keep what they consider law and order in this part of, as far as they're concerned, this part of the British Empire. The other image on the right then is of Tom Canole's house after it has been burnt out after it's a reprisal for the Renine ambush. So you can see it's a very poignant picture there. You can see some kids playing, or I don't know, are they his own family or just local children, but he lost his life in that particular house, as did a number of other people after the Renine ambush. So you can see that those incidents are recorded in the timeline for 1920. So that would have occurred in, I think I'm just going to check here, as far as I know, it was September 1920, and there you go. And the house was burnt in retaliation. There was other houses were burnt as well. The other photograph that I have in the pack is John Whelan's house in Parliament Street in Ennistimon. But it wasn't just Ennistimon was targeted. There were reprisals and homes looted in Cree, Doonbeg, Kilkee, Ennistimon, Lahinch, Milltown, Malbay, and possibly elsewhere as well. So there were very serious events in 1920. Reinforcements came in 1920. So you can see another propaganda image here. You can see the RIC men, or you can see a soldier there. You can see there's a veteran there on the right-hand side, but in the middle there with the pistol in his holster there is the auxiliary. So around March up to maybe May 1920, the new forces of, I suppose, technically extra police began to arrive. So you had the black and tans wearing the khaki and the RIC, mixture of khaki and RIC uniform. And then you had the auxiliaries, who were generally officers from the British Army who had fought in the First World War. And that corps became known as ADRIC, or the Auxiliary Division of the RIC. Later on, as the war went on, the black and tans became more like the RIC in terms of uniform, and the only way many people could distinguish between them was by their accents. So if we move on, I want to show you something from 1921 that is interesting, because children can actually get an idea of what reprisals were like. Early in 1921, it's either January or maybe early February, a lady came to Ireland whose name was Lady Sykes. Now, she was married to this gentleman here. This is Mark Sykes. He was an army officer. He was unusual because, as far as I know, he was a Protestant, became a Catholic. He was married to Lady Sykes. He died of Spanish flu, as far as I know. I think actually his body was exhumed much later after he died by one of the I think universities looking into the whole flu epidemic from the Spanish flu era to try and create a vaccine. So it's just an interesting aside given the COVID situation at present. But anyway, his wife, Lady Sykes, did come to 6 Mile Bridge. She was invited by the Peace for Ireland movement. Now, I have to say, give credit where credit is due, because on some accounts from the Peace for Ireland movement, many different people were invited to come, but she was actually one of the few that stood up and did come to Ireland. And if you want to see her in the 6 Mile Bridge area after the Glenwood ambush, then have a look at British Pathé News. And if you type in her name, Lady Sykes, you'll see her and another, there's a couple of other people with her just looking on. I think it happened the visit is possibly 2 weeks after the Glenwood ambush, and she and her traveling party are looking through the ruins of a house there in the 6 Mile Bridge area. So it's worth a look, and again, it's good for children to see the visual evidence from the time. Now, in 1921, also there were events, reprisals in Ennis. A person was shot in O'Shaughnessy's pub in Market Street in Ennis. The British authorities took exception to the shooting. It was actually a hand grenade used as well in the attack, and reprisals took place afterwards around April 1921. So among the list of targets at the time were the Old Ground Hotel, the Clare Hotel, Patrick Considine's house, and TV Honan's premises, just at the very top of Abbey Street, just out of shot of this photograph. Now, this photograph is courtesy of Marie Bow. Marie had this wonderful photograph here. I've put it in because it does include military vehicles. You can see them there in the photograph, what appears to be an RIC man with his military dress helmet in one of the vehicles, and possibly it's either a Scottish soldier or an auxiliary sitting in the one in the bottom left corner there with the WD on it. But you can see a group of women there around what is now Carrickdown. They're at the door there with their shawls on them. But it is an interesting photo. It may be, this photo, I believe, came back from America, and there's very little information on it, but I believe it might be from around the time of the destruction of TV Honan's premises. But somebody might have some more information about it. But the account is given of the destruction of TV Honan's premises by his son, Josh Honan. And you'll read that in the pack. It was actually included in a book. It was a letter sent to Sean Spellacy, and the letter is published in an article that he wrote for a book by Joe Power. I think it's called a portrait of, oh no, it's an Ennis Miscellany, actually. The Ennis Miscellany is the name of the book. And it's well worth reading that account, but I've taken a clip of that account and put it into the pack for children to get an idea of what happened during the reprisals. And it's one of the activities in the pack. This photograph then is courtesy of Oisin Murphy, and it shows the Ennis Company of the 1st Battalion of the Mid-Clare Brigade. Now, there are a number of photographs held by Clare County Library of different companies of the IRA at the time. I presume a lot of them were taken during the ceasefire and truce period, and this one possibly also comes from that time. Again, if anyone has any information, I'm sure Oisin, who gave me the photo, and his family would love to know. But if you do, we'd be delighted to hear from you anyway, but it will be included in the pack as well, this photograph here. Now, just as we head towards the end, really, of the explanation as to what I have included in the pack, it's important to look at the legacy and really what are we left with at the end of the War of Independence. Well, in today's, we'll say 100 years on, there are many monuments scattered around County Clare relate to events or people who fought and died, or passed away or accidentally injured or shot during the War of Independence, and they're very important to remember those who died. So again, as I said at the outset of the talk here, that site visits could be arranged for children to visit these monuments in the locality. Records also remain. I know that a number of years ago, maybe a year or two ago at this stage, could even be 3 years ago at this stage, the records of the Mid-Clare Brigade were found in a house, I think it was in Moore Street in Kilrush. And I know that they are now held in the University of Limerick. So again, records do survive. Records may still even be out there that are in people's homes, that might come to light in the next number of years. So those records are very important for kids to have a look at, just to use as evidence. They're sources of documentary evidence, really, so they're very useful. So again, if teachers come across any, they could create their own activities on them relating to their own area, if permission is given to use them. Weapons and grenades then are part of the legacy, because even if you Google it, weapons or grenades finds, particularly grenades from the War of Independence era, you'll find that they keep turning up in Dublin around the canals where they were dumped. They do turn up in County Clare. I know one was found very recently near Newmarket and Fergus, and another one in Lahinch, I think in an old outhouse or a shed. And they've been found in streams and rivers around County Clare. But just to be aware that they do exist. And again, if this has been discussed in the classroom, just to remind children that they are extremely dangerous, and that if they do come across, or even if adults come across anything like them, just to inform the authorities, because they can cause injury and even death. So just to be aware that they are part of the legacy. They're like unexploded landmines in other parts of the world. So just to treat them with caution if anyone does come across them. Again, then wounds really would be the last one I want to mention. Family members, obviously, from that time, quite a few people were wounded and carried those wounds into later life. But again, the wounds were not just physical. There was a lot of psychological wounds. And again, I suppose in Ireland, we're still dealing with some of the psychological wounds from that time and the Civil War that followed. So again, just to be aware of that as teachers when using the pack, that you're dealing with somebody's personal family history, and that they're real people who lived, and that there are many sides, not just two, but there are many sides to every story, and to treat people's family history with care and with tender care, really. Just to be aware of that. The image there on the right hand side, just to finish up on the legacy, is toy soldiers. You can see them there. They are the Free State Army. They're one of the first set of toy soldiers depicting the Free State Army, produced by the Britain's toy manufacturer company, but they were sold by White's auctioneers. So if you come across a set of those in your house, they're very valuable. So you keep them safe. And again, just before I finish up, this is the end of my slideshow presentation, but there are a number of things I want to show you just before we finish up in relation to a handling box that you could use for children. So just on this presentation here, just like to say Slánagh Gar Maithagh, but I'll stop sharing this and I'll go back to my screen here, and I'll just show you a number of items that are available if you are putting together a handling box for children. Now, why would you bother, we'll say, putting together a handling box? Well, if children are allowed to handle replicas or objects or things that relate to that time, they're obviously going to have more of an affinity with the subject that's been taught, but also they're more likely to remember it through their, by handling the object. I suppose kinesthetic learning kind of comes into it there. But there are different items available. Like you had seen the photograph of the armored car coming over the club bridge. Well, you can buy these. They're like the Airfix sets. That's an Austin armored car from World War One. So many of these sets are available on the internet. There are other scaled down models and items that you come across. Other such items then would be Matchbox did a series a number of years ago, models of yesteryear, and you can buy a 1918 Crossley Tender just for children to, you know, if you're dealing with the ambushes, and there's a lot of Crossley Tenders being involved in these ambushes. So again, if you want kids to see what a Crossley Tender actually look like, it's very handy to have scaled down models so they can actually hold it physically in their hand and have a look at the shape of it. But these are available all over the place on the internet. These are a couple of sets from a number of years ago, but they're still available to be bought. Airfix, again, do the models. There was a plane that crashed in, I think it's Punches Field or Punches Quarry in Cratloe during the War of Independence. Now, more than likely, the plane was a Bristol fighter, a biplane, or a, I don't know, two-seater plane anyway, because I know the IRA were trying to get the machine gun off the back of the airplane. But you can actually buy models of the plane involved, just again, if kids wanted to build them, just to see what came down in that field, if you're in the Cratloe area. It gives them an idea of kind of what was the type of plane or aircraft that was being used at the time. But there are many other objects. Buttons are also available, even something like an old map. Bicycles were very important during the War of Independence. They were used by the RIC, they were used by the Irish Volunteers, and they were used by the ordinary people. So it would be very important at the time to, if you were traveling to far-flung places around the county, to have your cycling map. So even in the handling box, something as simple as an old map. And these are all, I mean, they're 10 a penny on the internet if people were looking to buy them, to put them into a handling box. That's kind of it, really. Again, anything, old buttons are another one you'll find. They're for sale on different internet auction websites. You can buy buttons marked IV for the Irish Volunteers, or you can buy replica cap insignia, medals, that kind of thing as well on websites. So that's just really basically to make history come alive by creating the handling box. There'd be the different items that you could put into it. So that's it really on our talk on the pack. We've to just get it finally completed, and it should be available in PDF format when it's finally finished, and you can have a look at it for yourselves. So thank you very much for your attention, and thanks for listening. Thank you.